The day the auction hammer came down, I was standing at the back of the room with my hands in the pockets of a jacket that did not belong to me. My neighbor in Ghent, a retired school teacher named Peter, who had been trying to make me more presentable for 20 years without any measurable success, had lent it to me that morning. It was a good jacket, dark wool, the kind that said you belonged in a room like this without making too much of a claim about it. My own jacket was a canvas work coat that still had a faint oil stain on the left cuff from a job I had done 3 weeks earlier on a neighbor's boiler, and Peter had taken one look at it and walked to his wardrobe without a word. I was grateful for the jacket. I was less grateful for the shoes, which were half a size too small and were reminding me of this fact every 30 seconds. But I stood at the back of that auction room in the Rue du Midi in Brussels, and I watched my son, and the shoes did not matter at all. His name is Florian. He was 26 years old, and he was sitting in the third row from the front, wearing the same thing he always wore when someone made him come somewhere formal. Dark navy trousers, a white shirt with the collar button open because he would not tolerate anything at his throat, and the noise-canceling headphones that had been as necessary to his daily existence as his own hands since he was 9 years old. He was very still. He had taught himself to be still in public the way some people teach themselves a second language through years of practice and discipline and the specific desire not to be noticed. But I could see, because I had been reading the language of his body for 22 years, the small rhythmic motion of his right index finger tapping against his knee. 3 taps, pause. 3 taps, pause. His counting sequence. He was managing the room. Beside him was Annalise. She had been beside him for 4 years, and I intended to thank God for her specifically when I died, which I hoped would not be for some time yet. She was 31 Dutch, with red hair and the contained competence of someone who had learned early that the world required active management and had simply gotten on with the job. She was not watching the auctioneer. She was watching Florian the way I was watching him, with the particular attention of someone whose most important function in any given moment is to know what he needs before he needs it. The auctioneer, a Belgian man with the practiced voice of someone for whom enthusiasm had become a professional instrument, was addressing the room in 3 languages, in rotating sequence: French, then Flemish, then English. The piece on the easel was called Frequency 3. It was 140 centimeters by 200 oil and cold wax on board. And it was the most extraordinary thing my son had ever made, which was saying something because everything Florian made was extraordinary, and I was not simply his father saying this. The auction estimate had been 40,000 to 60,000 euros. The bidding had started there and had not stayed there for long, going once the auctioneer said in French at 112,000. I looked at Annalise. She pressed her knee lightly against Florian's, a small signal that I had seen her develop over 3 years of learning his vocabulary of contact enough pressure to register without startling a confirmation that she was there. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the dust moving in the light above the easel. Going twice. I thought about the apartment in Molenbeek in 2004. The social worker who had told me with the careful kindness of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis that Florian's profile was at the severe end of the spectrum and that I should manage my expectations about independent living, about employment, about what a full life might look like for a child like him. I thought about the nights I had lain on the floor of his bedroom because it was the only way he would sleep, my back on the hard boards and the ceiling above me, calculating what I owed the therapy clinic and what I had coming in from the plumbing jobs and how far apart those 2 numbers were. I thought about the afternoon I had come home from a job to find him sitting in front of the window with a blue crayon in his hand, drawing something on the glass, a series of concentric ovals that he had been making for 3 days on every surface he could reach. I had looked at those ovals for a long time. I had not wiped them off the window. I had bought him a sketch pad instead. Sold. 112,000 euros. The room exhaled. Annalisa turned to Florian and said something I could not hear. He nodded twice, the precise nod he used when he had processed information and confirmed it was correct. Then he did something that made the woman sitting next to him, a gallery director from Paris, who did not know him, turn and stare. He smiled, not the performed social smile he had spent years learning to deploy. the one that was technically accurate and slightly uncanny in the way all learned performances are slightly uncanny. He smiled the smile he reserved for things that were genuinely interesting to him, a structural solution. He had found a color combination that had resolved itself after weeks of resistance, the arrival of a specific outcome he had been calculating toward. It was a real smile, and it was brief, and then it was gone. I pressed my knuckles against my mouth for a moment and looked at the floor. Then I composed myself because I was 61 years old and a Dutch plumber from Ghent, and I was not going to weep in the Rue du Midi in front of people who had just paid 112,000 euros for a painting, even if the painting was made by my son, and even if I had believed, for some years in the worst period of the worst years, that we would not get here. I started making my way toward the front of the room. I did not get there. The main door opened. My name is Edward Smits. I am 61 years old, and I have been a plumber in Ghent for 33 years. Before that, I was a plumber's apprentice in Rotterdam, where I grew up, the second son of a harbor worker and a woman who had come from Friesland at 17 and never quite lost the particular quality of fierce practical optimism that part of the country seems to produce in people. I am not an educated man in the way that word usually means. I read a great deal, but I read what interests me, which is to say mostly history, and occasionally the kind of popular science writing that explains things like how the brain works or why certain colors appear to vibrate when placed next to each other, which is something I learned from watching my son work. I have 2 strong hands and a reasonable understanding of how water moves through pipes and what happens when it moves incorrectly, and I have raised a child alone, and I believe these things are the most important things I know. My wife's name was Renata. She was Belgian from Leuven, and I met her at a party in Bruges when I was 28, and she was 26, and both of us had come with other people and left talking to each other. She was a graphic designer with dark eyes and a quality of restlessness that I found compelling at 28, and that I came to understand differently over the following years. Not wrongly, not with bitterness, just differently. Some people have a relationship with the present moment that requires constant renewal and that cannot survive the particular stillness that descends when things become difficult in a sustained way. Renata was that kind of person. I knew this before Florian was born, and I loved her anyway, and I do not regret any of it, not the years we had. Not even the ending, because the ending gave me Florian alone, and Florian alone is the best thing I have done. Florian was born in 1998. He was a quiet baby, which the book said was normal, and then a quiet toddler, which the book said was less usual, and then a 3-year-old who did not speak in words, but communicated through an elaborate system of gestures and objects, and the specific placement of things that I learned to read by paying very close attention for a very long time. He could stack 12 small blocks in a precise formation at age 2 and become violent with distress if a single block was moved. He could spend 4 hours examining the pattern of light through a water glass on the kitchen table. He could not be touched unexpectedly without a reaction that was physical in its intensity, a full-body recoiling that looked to people who did not know him like something was very wrong, and that was in fact simply an accurate report of how much the unexpected contact hurt him. The diagnosis came when he was 4. The word autism existed in my vocabulary, but it was a word I had associated with a specific image, the silent child in the corner, the savant, with the extraordinary trick the person entirely separate from the social world. What the child psychiatrist in Ghent told me over an hour was more complicated and more specific, and in the long run, more useful than that image. She talked about sensory processing and executive function and the enormous variability of the spectrum, and what the research said about outcomes with early intensive intervention. She talked about the resources available and the resources not available, and the gap between those 2 categories. She was kind, and she was realistic, and I was grateful for the realism because I have always preferred accuracy to comfort. Renata sat beside me through most of that appointment. She asked good questions in the beginning and then gradually stopped asking questions and looked at her hands. On the drive home, she was quiet in a way that had a quality to it I recognized from arguments awaiting quality, and I thought she was processing, and I left her to it. She was processing something, but it was not what I had thought. She told me 6 weeks later. She said that she had known something for 2 years that she had been refusing to look at directly, which was that she had married a person she loved and had planned a life she recognized, and that neither the person nor the life could accommodate what Florian was and what he was going to need, and she could see no path forward that did not require her to become someone she was not capable of being. She said this sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of her. And I remember the cup specifically. It was the blue one with the chip on the rim, and I stared at it through most of what she said because I did not trust myself to look at her face. I want to be fair to Renata because fairness is something I think about. She was not a bad person. She did not hate Florian. She was not cruel. She was a person who knew what she could not do and chose not to do it, which is in certain lights an act of honesty, and in other lights something harder to name. She packed 2 suitcases, not one, which I found out later was because she could not fit everything into one and had to make 2 trips to the car. Florian did not understand that she was leaving. She stood in his doorway for several minutes while he sat on the floor arranging his blocks, and she said something to him that I did not hear, and then she left. He did not look up from the blocks. She moved to Antwerp initially. I know this because the first maintenance payment came from an Antwerp bank account. I did not follow her trajectory beyond that first fact. I did not want to follow it, and I did not have the emotional capacity to follow it, and I had other things that required everything I had. What I had was a 4-year-old boy who did not understand why the particular smell of his mother's shampoo had disappeared from the bathroom, and who communicated this not with words, because he did not have words then, but with a specific behavior that began 3 days after she left and continued for 11 weeks. He would go to the bathroom doorway every morning at the same time and stand there for a precise interval, and then walk away. I timed it once out of a need to understand the pattern. It was 4 minutes and 20 seconds every morning. After 11 weeks, it stopped. I do not know what resolution he reached. I know that he reached one, because he was always reaching resolutions that I could not access, processing things in the interior of his own experience, and arriving at conclusions that I could only infer from the behavioral change on the other side of the process. I hired a childminder for the hours I was working. A woman named Marta, who was Croatian and had been a special education teacher in Zagreb before she came to Belgium, and who understood Florian's requirements with a precision that I found immediately and deeply reassuring. She cost more than I had budgeted for. I adjusted the budget. There was no other option, and I spent approximately 0 time considering whether there was another option because there was not. She moved to Antwerp and later to Bordeaux and sent money for 3 years before she stopped, and I know she started a new life because I saw photographs of it once years later on a mutual acquaintance's social media feed, before I realized I had seen it and closed the screen. She had a garden in the photographs. She looked honestly like a person who had made her peace with herself. I found I did not feel what I had expected to feel about that. I felt nothing very specific, just the vague, low-level hum of the years between then and now. I raised Florian alone in the apartment in Molenbeek, and then when the lease ended and I had saved enough in a small house with a garden in Ghent. The plumbing work was steady, and I was good at it, and I built a client base over years through the specific method of doing the job correctly and being honest about what was wrong and what it would cost, and not charging for things that did not need doing. It was not a business model that made anyone rich, but it made me reliable, and in the trades reliable is a form of wealth. I worked around Florian's schedule, which meant early mornings and late evenings when the therapy appointments and the school pickup and the homework allowed. I became the kind of person who plans very carefully around a fixed structure, and I have never found this difficult because I was already by temperament a person who preferred a fixed structure. The therapy was expensive, and the specialist schools were expensive, and the equipment was expensive. The noise-canceling headphones at 9, the specific weighted blanket that allowed him to sleep, the occupational therapist who worked with him twice a week from age 5 to 12, and who I believe changed the trajectory of his life by teaching him that his body could be managed, that the chaos inside it was not permanent, but responsive to technique. I paid for all of it. I worked for all of it. I did not resent this. I want to be clear about that because people sometimes hear this kind of story and assume the resentment is underneath it coded into the self-sacrifice. It was not. I worked because Florian needed it, and because Florian was my son, and because there was nothing complicated about that equation. The drawing was always there. From the ovals on the window glass when he was 4 to the dense, methodical sketchbooks from age 7 onward, Florian processed the world through marks on surfaces. When he was 12, his occupational therapist suggested painting as a way of exploring large-scale physical work. The full-arm movement that she thought would help him regulate through proprioceptive input, which is a technical way of saying that moving his whole body to make something helped him feel where his body was in space, which was something he struggled to know without specific physical reference. I bought him 2 canvases and a set of oil paints from the art shop on the Vrijdagmarkt and left them on his desk. He did not touch them for 11 days. On the 12th day, I came home from work at 6 in the evening, and the kitchen table was covered in newspaper, and he was in the middle of a canvas 2 feet square, working with a palette knife and his bare hands. And the thing he was making had a quality that stopped me in the doorway for a long time. I am not going to pretend I understood from that moment that he was going to become what he became. I am going to tell you that I looked at what was on that canvas and felt something that had nothing to do with fatherly pride and everything to do with being in the presence of something real. It had the quality that I later learned to call presence in a work. The sense that the object in front of you is not a representation of something, but a thing in itself with its own weight and its own internal logic. He was 12 years old and he had made something that had presence. I bought him more canvases. By the time he was 16, he had filled the small room at the back of the house that I had given him for a studio and had migrated to the garage. By the time he was 18, he had a body of work that his art teacher at the specialist school. A woman named Lika, who remains one of my favorite people, said she had never seen anything like in 30 years of teaching. She was the one who contacted a small gallery in Ghent. She was the one who made the first call. I went with Florian to the gallery and sat in the office while the gallerist, a nervous man named de Coster, who clearly had not expected the artist to arrive with his father and noise-canceling headphones, looked at the work for a long time without speaking. Then he said he would like to include 2 pieces in a group show in March. Florian said, without looking at de Coster, that he would need written documentation of the lighting specifications for the display of each piece, because the works responded differently to different light temperatures, and incorrect lighting would misrepresent the color relationships. De Coster blinked. I handed him the specification sheet that Florian had written out and given me that morning, typed in the small, precise font he used for everything. De Coster included 2 pieces in the March show. Both sold on the opening night. He called me the next morning. De Coster included 2 pieces in the March show. Both sold on the opening night. He called me the next morning. He was in that phone call, a different person from the nervous man who had blinked at Florian's specification sheet. He was the man who had sold 2 pieces at a group show on opening night, and who understood. With the specific understanding of a gallerist who has been doing this long enough to know the difference between work that sells because of circumstances and work that sells because of itself, which of those categories applied here? He spoke quickly. He wanted to discuss representation. He wanted to discuss a solo show timeline. He wanted to discuss terms. I told him to send a contract to Thomas Vermeulen, whose name I had ready because I had called Thomas the previous week and told him what was happening and asked him to read a representation contract if one arrived. Thomas read it and sent back a list of questions. De Coster answered the questions. The contract was signed. Florian read it twice, asked 2 questions about the rights clauses, received satisfactory answers, and signed it in the specific, careful signature he had developed at 19 that reflected the deliberateness he brought to everything. The next 4 years were years of work. Florian worked every day. He worked with the discipline of someone for whom the work was not separate from the life, but was the central mechanism by which the life organized itself. He did not take vacations. He did not go to openings unless the opening was his own and attendance was professionally necessary. He did not go to parties. He did not cultivate the art world social relationships that many young artists consider essential to career development. He made work. He made it systematically, and he made a great deal of it. and the work grew in scale and complexity, and the critical response to it grew correspondingly. The years between that call and the auction room in Brussels are a story that I could tell for a long time, and that I will compress here because the shape of it is what matters, not the specific steps. Florian's work grew. The reputation grew with it slowly, and then quickly, the way reputations in the art world grow when the work is genuinely exceptional. Through word of gallery mouth and critical attention and the specific interest of collectors who trust their own responses to things over received opinion. He had his first solo show at 21. He had his first piece acquired by a museum collection at 23. He was quiet and consistent and completely uninterested in the social machinery of the art world, which paradoxically made the art world more interested in him. The mystery of the person added a dimension to the work that the work did not need, but that the market responded to. He met Annalise at 22 at a gallery event I made him attend. She was working as an arts administrator, had a degree in art history and a postgraduate qualification in cultural management, and had the specific quality of paying close attention to things without visibly performing the act of attention. Florian noticed her noticing him in the way he noticed things. Not immediately, but correctly. He told me 3 months after meeting her that she was interesting, because she did not try to manage him or explain him or prompt him to perform social behaviors he was not performing. She just asked him questions about the work and listened to the answers. I told him that sounded like a person worth knowing. He agreed. I was not expecting the telephone call that came 14 months before the Brussels auction. I was in Ostend working on a heating installation in a hotel near the seafront. It was a cold November morning, and the sea was the specific flat gray of the North Sea in November, which is a very particular shade of gray that has always struck me as the most honest color in the world because it contains no pretense of being something other than what it is. I was in the basement of the hotel with my hands inside a wall cavity when my phone rang. I looked at the screen. The number was Belgian but unfamiliar. I answered. The woman on the other end spoke French first, and then switched to Dutch when I responded in Dutch. She said her name was Renata Smits. I stood in the wall cavity with my hands in the dark, and I did not say anything for a moment. She said she had heard about Florian. She said she had been following his career for some time from a distance. She said the auction coming up in Brussels was significant, and she said she thought the time had come. She said those words specifically, the time had come, as if there were a schedule she was consulting. As if there was an appropriate chronology to these things that had been running in the background and had now reached the relevant moment. She said she wanted to reconnect with him. She said she had never stopped loving him. She said she wanted to be in his life. I listened to all of it. The sea outside the hotel was making the sound the North Sea makes in November, a low, consistent sound that is not quite a roar and not quite silence. Then I said, "Does Florian know you are calling me?" A pause. She said she wanted to speak to me first. I said, "What do you want, Renata?" She said she wanted to be his mother. I said I would think about it and ended the call. I stood in the basement for about 3 minutes. Then I went back to work because the hotel needed the heating system operational before the weekend, and I had made a commitment, and commitments are not conditional. I told Florian that evening. I had learned a very long time ago that telling Florian things directly and early and with accurate information was always better than managing disclosure, because Florian processed information the way most people process physical spaces, by needing to walk through every part of it before he could understand the whole. He needed time and he needed accuracy. Managing what he knew was a form of disrespect that I had resolved never to commit. He was in his studio when I told him, which is to say in the garage that had been converted with proper insulation and a north-facing skylight that we had put in together the summer he was 20. He was cleaning brushes, which he did at the end of every working day, with a methodical care that was characteristic of everything he did. I sat on the stool by the door. I told him his mother had called. I told him what she had said. I told him what I had said in response. I did not editorialize. I gave him the facts. He cleaned brushes for approximately 2 minutes. Then he said, "What does she want specifically?" I said I was not sure she was specific about that. He said, "She is coming to the auction." I said I did not know that. He said, "She is coming to the auction." He said it in the tone he used when he had derived a conclusion from available data, not a question, but a statement of assessed probability. He was usually right when he used that tone. He was right this time. She came to the auction with 2 other people. The door opened in the Rue du Midi while I was making my way through the room toward Florian, and I heard the change in the room before I turned around. The specific change that happens when something unexpected enters a space and the people in it have not yet decided how to process it. I turned. She was 61 years old. She had been 48 when she left. The 13 years had been kind to her in the way that money is kind to people, which is to say that the specific toll of those years had been managed rather than absorbed. Her hair was darker than I remembered it, and her clothes were expensive in a way that spoke of a different life than the one we had shared. She looked good. That is an honest thing to say, and I am saying it because I have committed to honesty in this account. She looked like a woman who had built a new life and had done it successfully. On her right was a man in his 50s, broad with the particular bearing of someone who has spent decades occupying space confidently. I would learn his name was Frederick Johnson, and that he was a property developer from Antwerp with considerable means and a history of marriages that trended in a specific direction. On her left was a woman I did not know carrying a document folder, dressed in the functional formal clothing of a professional services worker. A lawyer. Renata walked down the center aisle. She did not run. She was too controlled for that. She walked with the purposefulness of someone who has a destination and a plan. She was looking at Florian. Florian was still in his seat, headphones on, facing forward. He had not heard the door. He had not turned. "Stop," I said. I said it loudly enough that the people between us turned. I was pushing through them. "Stop, please." She did not stop. She reached the 3rd row and said his name. She said it in the particular voice that people use when they are performing a reunion. A voice that is too full of emotion to be believed, because genuine emotion does not come pre-shaped for an audience. Florian. She said it twice. Florian. He heard her the 2nd time. He took off the headphones. He turned. I cannot tell you exactly what was on his face because I was still 20 feet away, and the room was in the way, and my ability to read his face across distances under the specific circumstances of shock is less reliable than my ability to read it up close. What I can tell you is that what I saw was not the expression of a person greeting someone known to them. It was the expression of someone assessing an unknown stimulus. His face had the particular blank attentiveness of someone gathering data. She reached out and touched his arm. I want to be specific about what happened next, because it was significant, and because the significance was later misrepresented in a way that damaged us, and in a way that I believe I have an obligation to correct with the accurate account. Florian flinched. That is the word. Not a violent movement, not a striking out, not a dangerous reaction. He flinched. The way anyone would flinch when touched unexpectedly by a person they did not know, and the movement of his arm pulled it away from her hand, and her hand, which was reaching for him with the specific overextended gesture of a person not used to his spatial requirements, connected briefly with her own momentum, and she stumbled back 1 step. She was not hurt. She stumbled 1 step. She sat down. Not because she was pushed. She sat down because she sat down. I saw it. Annalise saw it. The gallery manager who was standing at the end of the row saw it, and I made a note of that because I knew we were going to need what he saw. But the lawyer who had come with her, the woman with the document folder, was already moving. She was already speaking to someone on a phone. And Renata, sitting in the aisle of the Brussels auction room, was looking at the cameras. There were 3 photographers in the room. Art auction photography, a normal thing. They had been there all evening. They were pointing their cameras at us. "My baby," Renata said. Her voice was not what it had been during the phone call. It was the public voice, the performance voice. She held her arm. "My son hurt me. He does not know what he is doing. This is why he needs protection. He is not capable of managing his own life or his own assets. I am his mother, and I am here to protect him." I reached Florian. I put myself between him and Renata, and I looked at him. He had put his headphones back on. He was looking at the ceiling. 3 taps on his knee, pause. 3 taps, pause. He was fine. He was managing. "Papa," he said. He did not look at me. He said it in the flat tone he used for factual communication. "Did you bring the car to the front, or is it in the garage on the Rue de Namur?" "It is in the garage," I said. "We should leave," he said. "Yes," I said. We left. The lawyer with the document folder said something to me as I passed her. I did not respond. Annalisa was on Florian's other side, one hand in his field of vision where he could see it without turning his head available, but not presuming. We walked out of the auction room and into the cold Brussels evening, and I called my own lawyer from the pavement while Annalise found the car, and Florian stood on the curb looking at the lights reflecting in the wet street with the attentiveness he gave to everything that interested him visually, which was most things. My lawyer was a man named Thomas Vermeulen, and I had been a client of his for 11 years since a dispute with a building contractor over a fee that Thomas had resolved efficiently and cheaply, and with the specific satisfaction of being entirely correct. He was 54 years old, methodical, the kind of lawyer who read everything twice and charged accordingly and was worth it. He answered on the third ring, and I told him quickly and precisely what had happened. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "They will file for conservatorship. Standard playbook. They will argue that the sale tonight and the accumulated assets require oversight and that his disability makes him a vulnerable person requiring legal protection." He paused. The flinch. Was it documented? The gallery manager, I said, stood at the end of the row. "Call him tonight," Thomas said. "Before anything else, get a statement by tomorrow morning." I called the gallery manager from the pavement. His name was Bertrand, and he was a careful, serious man who had been watching his gallery since 9 o'clock that morning and who told me what he had seen in clear, simple sentences that matched exactly what I had seen. I asked if he would be willing to make a formal statement. He said he would call his own lawyer in the morning to understand what that entailed, but that yes, he believed he had seen something important, and he was not inclined to let it be mischaracterized. The conservatorship petition arrived 4 days later. It was filed in the family court in Brussels by a lawyer named Céline Maurois, who I subsequently found out had a specialty in what she called vulnerability litigation, which is a practice area that handles cases involving adults whose capacity to manage their own affairs is argued to be diminished by disability, age, or cognitive impairment. The petition named Renata Smits-Janssen as the proposed conservator on the grounds that Florian Smits, artist holder of recently realized assets of approximately 112,000 euros from the auction sale, plus an existing portfolio of work valued at several times that amount, was a person with a diagnosed condition affecting his social and executive functioning whose financial and personal interests required formal legal protection. Thomas called me the morning after the petition arrived. His tone was the tone of a person who has read a document carefully and has a considered view. He said, "They have drafted this well. The disability framing is deliberate. They are going to argue that your management of his affairs, however benign in intent, has been informal and undocumented, and that a formal conservatorship administered by a person with a maternal relationship and legal standing is in his best interests." He paused. "We have two strong arguments. The first is competency. We will need a current independent assessment that documents Florian's actual capacity to manage his own affairs, which from what you described to me is considerably greater than they are going to suggest. The second is history. The history of abandonment, the absence." He paused again. "Do you have documentation of her absence?" 22 years of absence, I said. Thomas said, "I need everything. Therapy receipts, school records, tax records, the years without maintenance payments, any communication or lack of communication. Everything you have." I had everything. I had kept everything, because I had always been the kind of person who kept things a habit that came from my father, who had kept everything, and also because somewhere in my understanding of how the world worked, I had always known that documented reality was more durable than remembered reality, and that there might come a time when the documented version of 22 years would be more important than the remembered version. I had 38 labeled folders in a filing cabinet in the hallway of my house in Ghent. I had digital copies of everything in the cabinet. I had a second digital copy on a storage service that Annalise had set up for us 2 years earlier when she took over managing Florian's professional correspondence. I was a plumber from Rotterdam, and I had 38 labeled folders. I drove to Thomas's office in Brussels the next morning with the folders in the back of my car, and we spent 4 hours going through them. By the end of the 4 hours, Thomas had the look of a man who has found what he needed and has also found considerably more than he expected to find. He sat back in his chair and looked at the stacks of labeled folders and said, "Edward, how did you know to keep all of this?" I said I did not know specifically. I said I had kept it because it was true, and I believed true things should be kept. He said, "This is extraordinary documentation of 22 years. This is the most complete record of a child's development and a parent's sole responsibility that I have encountered in practice." He looked at me. "I want you to understand that when we go into that courtroom, this is not going to be a fair fight." He paused. "It is going to be in our favor." The period between this petition and the hearing was the hardest period of the whole thing. Harder in some ways than the worst years of the early diagnosis and the financial strain, because this hardness was specifically targeted. It had a shape and a direction and a face. Renata's lawyer filed motions. Thomas responded to the motions. There were preliminary hearings, procedural matters, requests for documentation on both sides. I want to describe one specific week during this period because it captures the texture of what we were living through and because I think the texture matters. On the Monday of that week, Thomas received a motion requesting that I be named as a party to the proceedings on the grounds that my management of Florian's finances over the preceding years constituted an informal conservatorship that had never been legally authorized and that my interests and Florian's interests might be in conflict. The motion was baseless, and Thomas said so clearly in his response, and the judge dismissed it in a preliminary hearing 2 days later. But the 2 days between the filing and the dismissal required Florian to know that the motion had been filed because I had committed to telling him accurate things, and the motion had a specific language in it about my management of his affairs that was written to sound like exploitation, and that Florian read with the focus he brought to everything and then was quiet about for a day in the specific way that meant he was processing something significant. On the Tuesday of that week, a journalist from a Belgian newspaper called my mobile phone. I do not know how he got the number. He wanted a comment on the story. The story, as he described it to me, had a framing that I recognized immediately as coming from Renata's team, the abandoned autistic artist, the overbearing father, the mother returning to reclaim her rightful role. I said no comment and ended the call. The article was published on Thursday. I read it once, identified 4 factual inaccuracies, and 1 outright fabrication, noted them in an email to Thomas, and did not read it again. On the Wednesday of that week, someone painted a slogan on the footpath outside my house in Ghent in red spray paint. It said, "Free Florian." I photographed it, sent the photograph to Thomas as documentation, and called a paving contractor I knew to remove it the following morning. Peter came over from next door and stood looking at it for a moment and then went home and came back with a bucket and a stiff brush and began working on it himself, which is the kind of thing Peter does. On the Friday of that week, Florian called me from his studio at 7:30 in the evening. He rarely called in the evening. I answered immediately. He said, "Papa." I said, "Yes." He said, "I want to tell you something." I said, "Go ahead." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "The work is going well." I said, "Good." He said, "I am telling you because I know this week has been difficult, and I wanted you to know that the work is going well, and I am not disrupted." He paused. "I know you worry about whether I am disrupted." I said, "I do worry about that, yes." He said, "I am not. I am working." He said, "That is all." I said, "Thank you for telling me." He said, "Good night, Papa." He ended the call. I sat at my kitchen table for a while after that call. The coffee was cold. The kitchen was quiet. I thought about the boy in the apartment in Molenbeek standing in the bathroom doorway every morning for 11 weeks. I thought about the ovals on the window glass. I thought about the afternoon I came home to find him making something out of nothing on the kitchen table. I thought about what it had cost both of us to get from there to here, and I thought about the fact that he had called to tell me the work was going well because he knew I worried, and he wanted me to know he was all right. And I thought about how that impulse, that specific caring attentiveness to another person's state, was something that certain people had told me people like Florian did not possess. They were wrong about a great many things. The press discovered the story because art world money plus disability plus abandoned mother makes a particular shape of narrative that the press finds irresistible. And for several weeks there were things written about us that I read once and then stopped reading because reading them was useful for approximately 0% of what I needed to do. What happened during those weeks that was genuinely difficult was the effect on Florian. He did not read the press coverage. He had a strict protocol about media and the internet, which Annalise administered and which I supported. And this protocol meant that the narrative being constructed about him in certain newspapers and on certain platforms reached him only in filtered form. Specific factual information that Thomas and Annalise and I agreed he needed to function effectively. What was not filtered was the disruption to his routine. The legal process required things of him that his routine did not accommodate meetings with the court-appointed assessor preliminary depositions. The knowledge that on a specific future date he would be required to be in a courtroom, and that the courtroom would make a determination about his life. Florian managed uncertainty through structure, and the legal process was structured on paper and uncertain in reality, and this combination was genuinely difficult for him. I watched him navigate it with a precision that I cannot adequately describe. He adapted his studio hours to accommodate the required appointments and then restored them exactly. He maintained his work. He completed 2 new pieces during the 6 weeks of the pre-hearing period, both of which sold immediately through the gallery. And the income from them went directly to the legal fund that Annalise had established because Florian had stated in the flat factual tone that he wanted to pay for his own defense. He told me this on a Tuesday evening in the studio. He said, "I have income. The legal costs are a consequence of my existence. It is appropriate that I pay for them." I told him he did not have to do that I would pay. He said, "Papa, you paid for everything for 22 years. This one is mine." The court-appointed assessor was a clinical psychologist from the University of Leuven named Dr. Van Hove, who spent 3 sessions with Florian over 2 weeks assessing his capacity for autonomous decision-making, financial management, personal care, and social functioning. I was present for none of these sessions, which was correct. I was outside the building for all of them in the car reading. After the 3rd session, Florian came out and got into the passenger seat and said, "She is thorough." I said, "Is that good or bad?" He said, "Good. Thorough is accurate. Inaccurate assessments have caused most of the problems." Dr. Van Hove's report arrived at Thomas's office 9 days before the hearing. Thomas called me at 7 in the morning, which was not a time he usually called. He said, "I need you to sit down when I read this to you." The report was 43 pages. I will give you its conclusion, which Thomas read to me while I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold. In summary, this assessor finds that Florian Smits demonstrates a comprehensive and sophisticated capacity for autonomous decision-making in all areas assessed. His capacity for financial understanding, long-term planning, personal care, and professional management is above average for his age cohort. His communication of preferences and requirements is consistent, coherent, and accurately reflects his genuine interests and values. There is no clinical basis for the restriction of his legal capacity in any domain. The assessor further notes that the subject has demonstrated an advanced understanding of the purpose and process of this assessment and has engaged with it appropriately, and that the suggestion that a person of his profile requires external conservatorship reflects a misunderstanding of the heterogeneous nature of autism spectrum conditions and the specific capacities of this individual. The assessor does not support the petition. I sat at the kitchen table for a while after Thomas finished reading. The steam from the coffee was rising very straight in the still air of the kitchen. I watched it. Thomas said, "Edward, are you there?" "I am here," I said. He said, "We have what we need." 3 days before the hearing, something happened that I had not anticipated and that changed the shape of the day in court in a way that I could not have engineered and that I believe was the result of my son's intelligence operating in a direction I had not fully tracked. Florian asked to see Renata. He told me this on a Thursday evening. He was cleaning brushes. He said, "I want to meet her before the court date. I want to understand her reasoning." He said this in the tone of a person who is undertaking a research process. I said, "Why?" He said, "Because the court will want to know whether I have considered the relationship. I want to have considered it completely before they ask." He paused. "Also, I am curious." I said, "Florian, she is going to try to use the meeting." He said, "I know." He said it in the tone that meant he had already factored this in. The meeting took place on a Friday afternoon in a meeting room at Thomas's office, which was neutral ground and which had, with Thomas's knowledge and Florian's explicit consent, a recording device operating throughout. Renata arrived with her lawyer, Céline Mauroy. Florian arrived with Annalise. I was not present. This was Florian's decision, and it was correct. I learned what happened in the meeting from the recording which Thomas transcribed and sent to me that evening. Renata had prepared. She spoke about the connection between them, about the love she had always carried, about the practical realities that had made her absence necessary words she had shaped carefully. Florian listened to all of it in the way he listened to things, completely and without interruption. Then he asked her questions. He asked her to specify in chronological order the dates and circumstances of each contact she had initiated with him since 2002. She was not prepared for this. The contacts had been minimal documented in my folders, and the chronological account that emerged from his questions was sparse and factually clear in a way that the emotional framing she had prepared could not survive. He asked her to describe what she understood about his sensory processing profile, his specific requirements for daily functioning, his work process. She knew very little. The answers she gave were general and approximate, and in several cases inaccurate. He noted each inaccuracy without comment and moved to the next question. He asked her what she believed the purpose of conservatorship was in cases where the subject had demonstrated documented capacity. She said it was to protect vulnerable people. He asked her to define vulnerable in the clinical context she was invoking. She could not define it with precision. He said without inflection, "I have read the clinical definition. I do not meet it." She said that was a matter for the court. He said, "Yes, that is why I am going to court." He then asked her one more question. He said, "Did you consider when you filed this petition that the process itself would cause me distress and disruption regardless of outcome?" She said she had considered that it was necessary. He said, "That is not what I asked." She was quiet. He said, "I am asking whether the impact on me specifically was a factor in your calculation." Another silence. He said, "I would like you to answer." She said, "I wanted to protect you." He said, "You wanted something." "I do not believe it was primarily my protection. That is my assessment based on available evidence. I think you should know that." The recording ended with the sound of chairs. The hearing was on a Tuesday morning in October. The family court in Brussels is in a building on the Boulevard du Régent that is old and formal and has the specific quality of rooms where consequential things have been decided for a long time. Florian wore the navy trousers and white shirt. He did not wear the headphones in the courtroom because he had decided he did not need them for this specific duration and in this specific environment, a decision that was his own and that I did not comment on. He sat very straight. Annalisa sat beside him. I sat behind them, and Thomas sat at the table beside Florian and Renata, and her lawyer sat at the other table, and the judge. A woman named Rector van de Castile, who had the bearing of someone who had been doing this for long enough to have become impossible to impress, looked at us all from the bench. The hearing took 4 hours. I will not give you each procedural movement because the procedural movements are not the interesting part. The interesting part was Florian. He had asked Thomas to allow him to speak directly at a specific point in the proceedings, and Thomas had prepared the ground for this. And when the moment came, Florian stood at the table and spoke to the judge in a voice that was level and clear, and that had none of the social performance anxiety that most people bring to a courtroom, because Florian did not have social performance anxiety. He had social difficulty of a different kind. But the specific anxiety of trying to appear appropriate to a powerful person was not in his register. He spoke factually. He described his daily life, his work, his financial arrangements, his decision-making processes, his relationship with Annalise, his relationship with me. his understanding of his own disability, and its specific implications for his functioning in each assessed domain. He cited Dr. Van Hove's report by page number at 2 points. He said at one point, "I want to be clear that I am not presenting myself as someone without difficulty. I have significant difficulty in several domains. I am presenting myself as someone whose specific difficulties do not constitute a basis for the restriction of my legal autonomy." He paused. "Those are different claims, and I want the court to understand that I understand the difference." He then said something that he had not discussed with Thomas or with me. He turned to look at Renata directly, which was the first time during the entire hearing that he had looked at her, and he said, "I do not hold a grievance against the person who brought this petition. I do not believe grievance is useful. I want to state for the record that I have considered the question of whether her absence from my life was damaging to me, and my conclusion is that it was not because the person who was present was sufficient." He looked at me then briefly before looking back at the judge. "My father was sufficient. I do not require any additional protection from or connection to anyone who is not present. That is my position." Rector Van de Castile looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at her notes. Then she looked at Renata's lawyer and said she would hear the response. Céline Maurois had prepared a thorough response. It occupied approximately 40 minutes and drew on 3 expert opinions that had been submitted in advance of the hearing and that argued from the perspective of disability advocacy and clinical practice that adults with autism spectrum conditions were statistically at elevated risk in financial and social situations, and that conservatorship as a protective instrument was an appropriate and proportionate response to this risk in cases involving significant assets. She was competent, and she argued the position well. Thomas then introduced the 38 folders, not all of them physically, but the contents of them systematically and in chronological order. The documentation of 22 years, the therapy receipts and the school records, and the IEP reviews, and the tax filings and the maintenance payment history, which showed 3 years of intermittent contributions and then nothing for 19 years. And the professional correspondence, and the gallery contracts, and the financial statements of the past 4 years of sales revenue and asset management, all of which was administered jointly by Florian and Annalisa through a legal structure that Thomas had helped them establish the previous year, and that was in its documentation a model of transparent and competent financial management. Dr. Van Hove's report came last. Thomas read the conclusion into the record. The courtroom was quiet. Rector Van de Castile retired for deliberation at 2:40 in the afternoon. We sat in the corridor outside the courtroom. Florian had his headphones on and was reading something on his phone, a technical article about pigment chemistry that he had downloaded before the hearing. Annalisa sat beside him with her coffee. I sat on the other side and looked at the tiled floor of the corridor, which was old marble white and gray, and which had a crack running across one section that someone had filled at some point with a grout that did not quite match the color of the original material. And I looked at this repair and thought about the specific problem of making a repair that has to be both structurally sound and visually honest, and how those two requirements are sometimes in tension, and how usually the structural requirement wins and the visual honesty is what remains visible as evidence of the repair. She was back in 40 minutes. Rector Van de Castile read the judgment without preamble. She said that the court had considered the petition and the evidence submitted by both parties and the testimony of the subject and the report of the court-appointed assessor. She said that the standard for conservatorship under Belgian law required a finding of incapacity in the specific domain in question, and that the evidence in this case not only failed to establish such incapacity, but actively demonstrated a level of capacity in financial, professional, and personal domains that was in the court's assessment above average. She said that the petition appeared to this court to rest on a conflation of disability with incapacity that was not supported by the clinical evidence, and that the court would note this conflation for the record as a matter of concern regarding how disability was being framed in the petition. She said the petition was dismissed. She said costs were awarded against the petitioner. She closed the folder and looked up. Florian took off his headphones. He said in the flat, factual tone, "Good. Can we get something to eat? I have not had lunch." Annalisa made a sound that I realized after a moment was her laughing, one short controlled burst that she pressed her hand to her mouth to contain. I looked at the ceiling of the corridor for a moment, then I said yes. Let us get something to eat. We had lunch at a small restaurant on the Place du Grand Sablon that Annalise had identified before the hearing as a contingency location for either outcome because she was the kind of person who identified contingency locations. Florian had the soup and the bread and ate in the methodical way he ate everything, which is to say, completely and in a specific order. He did not talk about the hearing. He talked about the pigment chemistry article he had been reading, a section about the specific opacity properties of lead white versus titanium white, and how the difference in the way those two whites interact with underlying layers created fundamentally different possibilities for the way light moved through a painting. He was interested in this in the way he was interested in everything relevant to his work, which was fully and specifically and without the social attenuation that makes most technical conversation boring. I listened. Annalisa contributed 3 questions that showed she had been paying attention to this topic for some time. I ate my soup. On the way back to the car, Florian said, without looking at me, "Papa." I said yes. He said, "I want you to know that what I said in the courtroom was accurate." He said, "You were sufficient. You were always sufficient." I stopped walking for a moment. The Place du Grand Sablon was bright in the October afternoon, the antique shops with their windows and the fountain, and the people moving through it in both directions, and Florian was walking ahead of me, hands in his pockets, already thinking about something, already in the next thing. I said, "I know Florian." He nodded once. He kept walking. I stood there for another moment and then I followed him, because he was my son, and that was the job. And it had always been the job, and I had never once wanted it to be anything other than exactly what it was. The months since the hearing have been quiet in the way of aftermath, the specific quiet of a situation that has been resolved and whose resolution is now becoming ordinary. Florian is in his studio every morning at 8. He has begun a new series that he describes in the sparse vocabulary he uses for work in progress as a study in signal and noise, which he says is about the relationship between information that is meaningful and information that is interference. The preliminary pieces I have seen on the easel when I visit are extraordinary. He is the best painter of his generation, and he is 26 years old, and this is simply true. Annalisa is running the business with the efficiency she brings to everything she runs. She has established a foundation registered in Belgium that provides documentation support and legal referrals to families of disabled adults facing capacity litigation, the specific kind of situation we faced, where the law is used not to protect a vulnerable person, but to access their assets under the guise of protection. She calls it the Van Hove Foundation, after the assessor who has agreed to serve on its advisory board. Florian donated the proceeds of the sale of Frequency 3 to it, the full 112,000 euros. He told me he had considered whether to keep it and had decided against it because the money had been made in the room where his mother had also appeared, and he did not want the two things attached to each other in his financial records. I said, "That is a significant amount." He said, "Yes, it will help a significant number of people." Renata wrote a letter, one letter 3 weeks after the judgment. It arrived at the house in Ghent in an envelope addressed to Florian. He gave it to me unopened and said, "Would you hold this for me?" I said I would. It is in the filing cabinet in the 39th folder, the one I added after the hearing. He has not asked for it. Maybe someday he will. He will know when the right time is, and it will be his decision, as it has always been his decision, as all the decisions about his life have always been his to make when the world allowed him to make them. I am sitting in my kitchen in Ghent as I write this. The window is open slightly, and the air is cool, the beginning of winter, in the way that you can feel it before you can measure it. The coffee is good. The house is quiet. I have a boiler job in Bruges tomorrow morning that I am looking forward to because it involves a problem in the distribution manifold that I have been thinking about for 3 days and that I believe I understand now and want to test. Peter came over last Sunday for coffee, as he does most Sundays. He brought a cake from the bakery on the Korenmarkt that is too large for 2 people, but that we worked through methodically, which seems appropriate. He asked me how I was. I told him I was good. He looked at me for a moment with the specific attention of a man who has known you for 20 years and knows the difference between the word good as a social performance and the word good as an accurate report. He said, "You look lighter." I said, "I feel lighter." He said, "Good." He ate his cake. What I have been thinking about in the weeks since the hearing is the nature of evidence. Not legal evidence, though, that too. The broader kind, the evidence of a life. The documentation of 26 years in 39 labeled folders is a form of evidence, but it is not the only form, and it is not even the most important form. The most important form is the person himself. The way Florian stood in that courtroom and spoke clearly and cited page numbers and looked at his mother with the calm assessment of someone who has thought carefully about a thing and reached an honest conclusion. That was the evidence that mattered most, and it could not be filed in a folder, and it could not be made by anyone other than him. Through his own years of work and difficulty and discipline, and the specific courage it takes to function in a world that is frequently very loud when you are someone for whom loudness is a form of pain. I think about the social worker who sat across from me in Ghent in 2002 and told me to manage my expectations. She was not cruel. She was giving me information based on the best data available to her at the time. But the data did not account for the specific person. The data was about a population, and Florian is not a population. He is a person. And persons exceed the data about them in both directions toward difficulty and toward extraordinary capacity. And the only way to know which direction a specific person will exceed the data is to stay long enough to find out. I stayed. That is the whole of it. I stayed and I paid attention and I kept records and I made sure he had what he needed. And then I stood back far enough to let him become what he was going to become without my shape being too strongly imposed on his. That is not a heroic thing. It is the job. Every good parent knows this. You make yourself necessary in the way that is actually useful, and you make yourself unnecessary in the ways that are not. And you do this continuously and imperfectly, and you trust that the person you are raising will correct your errors if you make yourself the kind of person they can tell the truth to. Florian can tell me the truth. He has always been able to tell me the truth. I take some credit for this, and I give him most of the credit because the capacity to tell the truth requires not only a person who will receive it, but a person who values accuracy above comfort, and that value is entirely and completely his own. I am 61 years old and I have been a plumber for 33 years, and I have strong hands and a reasonable understanding of how water moves, and I have raised the best person I know. The world will tell you various things about what constitutes success. I know what constitutes success. It is sitting in your kitchen on a November morning with a good cup of coffee and a boiler problem to solve and a son in his studio making things that will outlast both of you. It is the 39 folders and the fact that they are no longer needed because the case is closed and the truth has been formally established, and my son's life is entirely his own. It is Annalisa calling me Edward in the tone that means family. It is Peter and his cake. It is the specific quiet of a house where nothing bad is happening. I am 61 years old, and I still have work that I find interesting, and a son who makes things that change how people see, and a woman named Annalise who calls me Edward in the specific tone that means she considers me family, which is the only tone that matters. People ask me how I did it. How a plumber from Rotterdam raised a child alone and fought a legal system and won. I tell them the same thing every time. I did not do anything unusual. I showed up, I kept records, I told the truth, I paid attention. I loved someone not because it was convenient or because the outcome was predictable, but because the person was there and needed to be loved, and I was there to do it. The most important tool I own is not in my work bag. It is not a pipe wrench or a soldering iron or a pressure gauge. It is the 39 labeled folders in the filing cabinet in the hallway, not because they won a court case, though they did, but because they are 26 years of evidence that my son's life was real and attended to and witnessed by someone who was paying close attention. And no court, and no petition, and no lawyer, and no woman with a fur coat and a plan could make that untrue. Florian's new series is called Signal. The first piece sold last week for 140,000 euros. He did not come to the sale. He was in his studio. He heard about it from Annalise at 5 o'clock and said, "Good." He went back to work. That is my son. That is the boy who used to draw ovals on the window glass in the apartment in Molenbeek, and who could not be touched without pain, and who has made something of such quality and such clarity that the world has had to reorganize its understanding slightly to accommodate it. I am his father. That is the whole job. That is the only job, and I would do every day of it again without changing a single hour.